I'll let people in.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the last seminar in our series from the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. It is a great pleasure to introduce Paul Humphrey from Colgate University, which I've now learned is near the Canadian border in upstate New York. Paul Humphrey did his PhD in modern languages at the University of Birmingham, and his research looks at gender, sexuality in African-derived religions in Caribbean, and specifically Caribbean literature. And he's written a monograph called Santeria, Vodou and Resistance in Caribbean Literature, Daughters of the Spirit, which came out in 2019. He also coordinates an initiative called Queer Activism at Colgate University, where he's based, which is a digital history project that does a kind of digital timeline and oral history recordings with alumni of Colgate and faculty and staff and so forth. So today, Paul is going to talk to us about Oceanic archives and Afrodiasporic spirituality in comics from the Caribbean diaspora, which is a thing in which I recently, because James Scora and I, working with Malena Bedoya and Avellami Ortega, all work on a project called Comics and Race in Latin America. So this is a subject that is close to our hearts at the minute. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to welcome Paul here, and I'll pass the floor over to him.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Peter and Ignacio, for inviting me, and thank you to James as well, who heard my research at a conference last summer. I'm just going to share my screen as I have some visuals for us to see, and while I organize all my windows in front of me. And yeah, so this presentation is part of a longer piece that is going to come out in July. And in that other piece, I'm going to be talking about these two comics I'm discussing today, and also two other comics in that piece, a Brazilian comic called Tales of the Orishas, and another comic by one of the creators from today called Greg Anderson-Elysée, and that comic is called Isnana the Weir Spider. But I'm just going to focus on the two that we see on the screen now, La Borinqueña and Marassa, and I'll get into the presentation. So when I can find my mouse. Okay, so immediately prior to the Santarians' reintroduction in Marvel Comics, the Amazing Spider-Man series, Amazing Spider-Man, Amazing Grace series from 2016, Spider-Man steps into Santeria practitioner Don Anselmo's altar room and exclaims, "Voodoo dolls, voodoo dolls, voodoo dolls." He's a witch doctor. He's had congress with the beast. The 5 members of the superhero team, originally introduced in the Daredevil Father series from 2005, embody 5 individual Orisha or spirits from the Afro-Cuban religion Reta de Ocha, which is also known as Santeria and Lukumi. Spider-Man's outburst can be seen as a critique of the stereotypical discourse that abounds in the North American imaginary regarding Afrodiasporic religions, whereby the jocular neighborhood superhero repeatedly missteps in comprehending the structure and worldview that Santeria presents for its practitioners. In response to the team's increasingly exasperated explanation that, quote, "we believe that nature binds all things together, people, animals, heaven and earth," Spider-Man quips, "and the tree and the rock and the land and the ship, like the force, got it," before he then describes them as quote unquote super weather friends. I use this as an introduction to exemplify the ways that Afrodiasporic religions of the Caribbean and its diasporas have been perceived by particularly well-known characters in mainstream comics in the last decade. This is a topic I've discussed before in an article for Studies in Comics, and Spider-Man is by no means the only example of creators for Marvel referencing quote unquote voodoo in stereotypical and reductive ways. Brother Voodoo and Aurora Monroe or Storm are two examples that have seen considerable progress in how they are represented since being created in the 1970s. Looking to Nala Hopkinson, Dan Waters, and Dominique Stanton's House of Whispers, published between 2018 and 2020, as a series within Neil Gaiman's The Sandman universe line. Here, Haitian Vodou and Louisiana Voodoo are framed in a way that resonates with current scholarship and practitioner perspectives of these religions. However, this presentation is going to turn away from the mainstream to focus on the two independently published titles by creators of Caribbean descent currently residing in New York City. Marassa by Haitian-American writer Greg Anderson-Elysée, and La Borinqueña by Nuyorican creator Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez. In recent years, independently published comics have sought to examine the relationships between African and Afrodiasporic spiritualities and the sea, from Cameroonian and French creator René Debussy's Mulatako and Jiba Molay Anderson's The Horseman, to Afua Richardson's forthcoming Aquarius, The Book of Mer, and Malachi Bailey's Her. My analysis here is framed by perceptions of the sea and ocean as archives for many aspects of the Black experience. And today, I'll focus on the Afrodiasporic religions of Vodou and Santeria, as well as indigenous Taíno spirituality from Puerto Rico. Viewed through this oceanic lens, these comics turn away from the global north to delineate Black and indigenous-centered epistemologies and ontologies that foreground reciprocal and mutually constitutive relationships between humans, more than human entities, and the environment. In his oft-cited poem, The Sea is History, Derek Walcott underscores the historically complicated and traumatic relationship that exists between African diasporic peoples, especially in the Caribbean, and the sea. As he demonstrates, the waters of the Atlantic and Caribbean Sea are archives of the Black experience, a topic numerous scholars turn to when discussing Afro-diasporic religions. Omise'eke Natasha Tinsley and Tony Presley-Sanon, for example, both explore the deep connections that exist in Haitian Vodou between the sea, history, and myth. Their work underscores the multivalence of the word histoire, a term in Haitian Creole, which means both history and or histories and story or stories, but also, as Presley-Sanon observes, goes beyond them both to encompass memory. For her part, Tinsley's book Ezelie's Mirrors, Imagining Black Queer Genders, focuses on the family of Loa or Vodou spirits known as Ezelie, and on, quote, how Vodou preserves histoire, stories or histories, like that of woman-loving Danto and gender-shifting La Sirène, stories of gender and sexual creativity that are also myth-historic records of slavery and revolution. Similarly, Jacqui Alexander writes in her exploration of pedagogies of the sacred that, quote, water overflows with memory, end quote. Such memories of celebration, trauma, and resistance are written onto the sea through the embodied spiritual practices of Afro-diasporic and indigenous communities, through rites and rituals that implicate the body and the waters as conduits of spiritual and ancestral connection. As Alexander recounts, many reformulations have taken place in The Crossing. For example, Yamaya, Orisha of the sea and maternity, and her associated Orisha Yemanja, quote, reign in Candomblé and Lukumi, assuming the position that had been accorded her river sister Oshun in Yoruba land, end quote, while La Sirène, Agwe, Ezelie Danto, and Ezelie Freda fulfilled this role in Haitian Vodou. The histories, spiritualities, and lived experiences of enslaved individuals, both those who did not survive the holding in the sea and those who did, are left as traces on and in the water, with us still in the time of the wake, to quote Christina Sharp. As Sharp continues, through wake work, it is possible to imagine ways of knowing that past in excess of the fictions of the archive, and simultaneously recognize the many manifestations of that fiction and that excess, that past not yet past, in the present. More recently, Elizabeth DeLoughrey has developed the concept of sea ontologies, derived from the oceanic imaginary in current cultural production concerned with our watery futures. As she writes, the Atlantic is, quote, and an oceanic archive that lacks the place-based narrative and rituals of memorialization. And thus, in this context, sea ontologies might characterize the connection between an ancestry, history, and non-Western knowledge systems in submarine aesthetics that we see in the Caribbean and beyond. No longer blank space or aqua nullius, as she says, these waters are imagined and depicted as a multi-species and embodied place in which the oceanic contours of the planet, including its submarine creatures, are no longer outside the history of the human. It is to these multifaceted connections and their complex spiritual, epistemological, and ontological meanings that this paper turns, focusing on the many histoires written in the wake that, when further elaborated, offer the potential for decolonial futures based on reciprocal relationships with the physical and spiritual environment. Beginning with Anderson-Elysée's Marassa, this comic takes its name from the twin lois or spirits of Haitian Vodou, the Marassa, which is also the source of the fraternal twin protagonists' names, Mara and Sa. Unfortunately, the comic paused production after just 2 issues, but it is described as an Afrofuturist space opera that brings together space pirates, bounty hunters, humanoid snake doctors, cosmic Vodou, and breathing wooden mask babies. In the narrative present, Mara is a princess on an unnamed planet whose queen and crown prince have the infinitesimal cosmologies of space depicted on their skin, while Sa continues the twins' original joint enterprise as space pirates, joined by his adopted son and wooden mask baby, Petit. Seeking to traverse linguistic and national or colonial boundaries still present in the region, Anderson-Elysée incorporates French, Spanish, and Haitian Creole into his mostly English language narrative, while the diegesis and artwork draw heavily on interconnected Afrodiasporic spiritualities from across the Caribbean and its diasporas. At a foundational level, the Marassa function as a key organizing principle of this comic. In Vodou, the spiritual power of the twins is derived from the strength of the bond that exists between them, which in Marassa is reiterated on multiple levels. Beginning with the cover, the source of power visually emanates from Mara and Sa's joined hands, while the partial veve for the Marassa is incorporated into the title's lettering. And just as a side note here, the veve are elaborate cornmeal drawings that both represent and propitiate the loi during Vodou ceremonies. And it's incorporated, as you can see, under the title or into the title of the comic. These strong ties are repeated throughout. The same energy radiates from Sa and Mara's hands when he entreats her to join his new quest in the comic. The golden yellow of Mara's outfit in issue 1 is replicated in Sa's bandana and the curl designs on his jacket. The purple of Sa's jacket throughout the issue reappears in Mara's clothing at the end of issue 2. Additionally, as Presley Sanon notes, the Marassa twins have a close association with Legba, the guardian of the crossroads in Haitian Vodou. After Sa's death at the end of issue 1, his lover Shelley searches for his twin spirit in the waters surrounding her bar, Sankofa. As she descends, Legba's veve appears in her eyes, prefiguring her encounter with the Loa himself. In this way, the depths of the watery seas constitute the crossroads between the realms of the physical and the spiritual, the living and the dead. A descent en bas de l'eau, or underwater, is multiply significant in Haitian Vodou, with the depths of the ocean constituting the passage to what Presley Sanon terms the mythical Guinéen, where the Loa, the Gede spirits, and the Gede, or the spirits associated with death, and the spirits of the ancestors reside. Additionally, for those devotees whose initiation into Vodou involves a period of time en bas de l'eau, Tinsley notes that the water transports you, quote, beyond words, beyond space-time, beyond self, as you drift, before reaching the clarity of knowledge initiation provides. Shelley seeks this connaissance, this spiritual and ritual knowledge, and in a series of wordless panels that replicates the suspension of time and sense of self, she engages different spiritual traditions of the region, divining Sa's death through a card reading and collecting symbolic gifts to propitiate the Loa and Orisha in exchange for their assistance. First, she encounters Legba in a characteristic red and black tunic, followed by his Santeria counterpart, Elegua, who wears the black and red beaded bracelets and necklace associated with this Orisha. Together, Legba and Elegua accompany Shelley across the underwater threshold to meet representative entities of several Vodou and Santeria spirits. The pink waters here indicate the presence of the Vodou Loa Esli Freda, whose other counterparts in Vodou, Santeria, and Brazilian Candomblé are invoked in numerous visual references: the gold jewelry, the yellow tail, the heart-shaped veve where her torso and tail meet. Registering Shelley's pain for her lover, this spirit of love, sexuality, and sensuality then transports her by means of a wordless, intimate kiss to Guinéen. In short, in this fluid space, this oceanic archive, Shelley has gained the connaissance necessary to fulfill her own role, that of the Dosu or Dosa, the third twin, who with Mara and Sa forms the Vodou Loa known as the Marassa Trois. Inherently powerful, the Marassa Trois troubles the notion that twins function as a binary, instead foregrounding the power of the third entity that comes afterwards, an embodied example of the oft-cited description of the Marassa Trois, 1 + 1 = 3. Shelley's role as the Dosa is gestured towards in the comic's artwork. The 3 dots on each of her cheeks through both issues contrast with the 2 on the cheek of Sa in Guinéen. Shelley also appears with 2 further black markings on her face throughout this sequence, one on her forehead and the other on her chin. And between these 2 is situated the 2 sets of 3 dots, demonstrating in multiple forms the position that she holds. Presley Sanon describes the Dosu Dosa as the, quote, attendant third element space moment of resolution or completeness through creativity, unquote. A role Shelley fulfills in locating Sa to reestablish the connection between the fraternal Marassa. In resolution, at the issue's close, Mara is dressed in the purple associated with Sa, propped up on a seat whose purple cushions form the bones of the dead often seen in depictions of the Gede, while Shelley, with a further 2 sets of 3 markings on her breastplate, pilots the ship to rescue the missing members of their multiple Marassa Trois. Framed thus, the sea constitutes this third space, the site of resolution or completeness through creativity that Presley Sanon invites us to think about. In Marassa, the water takes the reader beyond words, to quote Tinsley from above, in a 5-page sequence of panels without captions or dialogue, where the colors and details of the artwork convey the connaissance the reader seeks. This multivalent site of trauma and possibility is the space in which the colonial notions of extraction and expendability of characters of African descent are challenged through the transcorporeal process of transpossession. In discussing the philosophical ramifications of transcorporeality, Roberto Strongman writes that the labeling of colonized and enslaved Black bodies as, quote, soulless, so as to close off their philosophical corporeal openness, went hand in hand with legislatively prohibiting those religious rituals of transpossession that render Black bodies inhabited or soulful, end quote. The transformations we see in the characters and the spirits with whom they are associated do the wake work that Sharp charges, recognizing the histoire of death and spiritual and ancestral connection found in the waters surrounding Sankofa, which itself is an Akan symbol representing the intertwined nature of past, present, and future. From descending Ombadro to charting a journey in the skies, the space pirates and bounty hunters of Marassa write the histories of oppression and possibility, division and connection in the wakes they trace across the comic's celestial waters. These celestial waters come to be of central importance to the narrative in Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez's La Borinqueña, the other comic I'm going to discuss today. With its first issue released at the end of 2016, La Borinqueña line now comprises 4 issues and a one-shot, alongside the character's numerous appearances in an anthology released to raise funds for relief after Hurricane Maria in 2017, as well as a sequence of 4 mini-comics on Chocolate Cortés wrappers in Puerto Rico, and, as we can see in the bottom right, a brand new spin-off issue titled Oro, el Coquí Dorado. La Borinqueña is the series' eponymous environmental activist superhero, whose name is derived from the original Taíno name for Puerto Rico, Borinquen. An Afro-Nuyorican, La Borinqueña's powers are derived from her connection to the Taíno spirits of motherhood and of the sea, wind, and mountains, which she uses to fight alongside activists resisting colonial and neo-colonial powers in Puerto Rico. Numerous scholarly and journalistic articles have examined the narratives in La Borinqueña, and so today I'm just going to focus on La Borinqueña's connections to Taíno and Afro-Puerto Rican spirituality, the environment, and the ways the comic engages with the notion of sea ontologies in its presentation of a decolonial framework for Puerto Rico. Marisol, La Borinqueña's alter ego, cements her connection with Taíno spirituality in the course of her senior thesis research, during which she unwittingly discovers the 5 crystal tears of the Taíno mother spirit Atave, which you see on the left. These tears combine to form the elusive Estrella del Camino, which affixes itself to the chest of her outfit, as if sewn in the same position occupied by the star in the top left corner of the handmade 19th century independentista flag of Lares. In this interaction, Atave reiterates the manifold ties that La Borinqueña already holds with the geography, topography, and ecology of Puerto Rico through her studies, environmental activism, and her name, Marisol Ríos de la Luz, or Sea and Sun, Rivers of Light. Instructed by Huracan to feel the wind at her command because humanity's ways have altered the natural order, La Borinqueña is able to mitigate the effects of the storm barreling towards Aguadilla, caused by what the spirits have framed as the unnatural relationship humans now maintain with the environment. And worthy of note here is that this is from issue 1 of the comic. And this happened, the issue that was published 9 months before Hurricane Maria. So we're thinking about this being published in 2016, and the Hurricane Maria happens 9 months later in 2017. So tying politics together with environmental activism, the one-shot included at the end of the issue shows La Borinqueña's successful actions to prevent the dumping of toxic waste in unregulated landfill sites in Peñuelas. And other issues that we see in the series of comics are things like the consequences of earthquakes for the archipelago, the impact of tourist development of the coastline, the continued reliance in Puerto Rico on fossil fuels over solar power for investor profit, and the harmful effects of human activity for turtle nesting and on the bird, frog, and bat populations. The unveiling of Marisol's powers is inherently tied to water, whereby she locates the metaphorical sea water cum crystal tears of Atave, while battling against the fresh water flowing through the caves after the storm. While this is framed in terms of Taíno spirituality, and we'll return to that in very shortly, La Borinqueña also serves as the conduit for Afrodiasporic spiritualities, histories, and epistemologies of Puerto Rico. The association between the sea and Yemaya is clear, an observation which is made explicit in issue 2 when La Borinqueña appears to Pedro and Julio, as you see here, as they escape homophobic and racist abuse walking under New York's Williamsburg Bridge. In addition to his invocation of Yemaya upon seeing the superhero, Julio's own association with the Orisha is indicated by the blue color of his Aleke, which is the ritual beaded necklace that indicates his initiation as a child of, or at least in service to, Yemaya. This interwoven spiritual tapestry is further exemplified as the opening chapter of issue 2 progresses. Following La Borinqueña's invocation as Yemaya, the reader encounters a flashback of Marisol in a shirt with a Taíno symbol for the coquí frog, accompanied by her father wearing the red color of his own namesake, Chango. In the myths of Santeria, Chango is sometimes said to be the son of Yemaya, And thereby, the fact a filial bond exists between the two Orishas is also replicated here. Moreover, this flashback prefaces La Borinqueña being led by the waters that, quote, replenish my body, mind, and spirit, end quote, to place a living coquille she finds by the river at the base of a ceiba tree. If Shelley descends to the depths in Marassa to seek out Sa among the spirits of death in Guinéen, here, the water brings La Borinqueña to the ceiba, which is the sacred tree for both the Taíno and practitioners of Santeria. The ceiba is the means through which spirits of the ancestors and the Orishas can manifest themselves. And as we see in the center panel here, the cimarrones manifest themselves through the ceiba tree to La Borinqueña. After La Borinqueña is enclosed in the star at the end of this issue, she must navigate the multiple histories, stories, and memories of resistance, past, present, and future, and develop the conocimiento, which is akin to connaissance, required to prevent the ongoing extraction of power from La Estrella del Camino and all it represents. The moment where La Borinqueña is trapped within La Estrella del Camino serves as just one example of the way that governmental and business interests in Puerto Rico maintain an extractivist relationship with the archipelago. While attempting to unite protesters and police against Dulcinea, which is a company that has diversified from the colonial sugar industry to machinery, property development, and we later find out human experimentation, La Borinqueña is forcibly detained by the company's private militia, who appear in helicopters emblazoned with the word caña, or sugarcane. The militia sidestep any interaction with representatives of the police and act directly as a colonizing force, using vast amounts of electricity to first immobilize La Borinqueña, and then again to capture La Estrella del Camino itself. The use of such quantities of power by a mercenary force, whose employers were motivated by the huge potential profits from monetizing the star, directly critiques then Governor Rosselló's plan to privatize Puerto Rico's power grid after the hurricane, not least since at the time of publication, electricity service had not been restored to the whole archipelago. In the Battle for Paradise, Naomi Klein outlines the Puerto Rican government's incentives aimed at, quote, high net worth individuals lured to permanently relocate to Puerto Rico by a cornucopia of tax breaks and the promise of living a 5-star resort lifestyle inside fully privatized enclaves year-round. Particularly notable among those moving to the island are cryptocurrency millionaires, as Klein notes, and films like Cecilia Aldorondo's 2020 documentary Landfall have demonstrated. Quote, mining cryptocurrencies is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, Klein observes, due to the amount of electricity it consumes. And while most companies would likely continue their mining ventures elsewhere, the idea of turning an island that cannot keep the lights on for its own people into the epicenter of this multi-trillion-dollar market is raising mounting concerns of crypto-colonialism. In this context, La Borinqueña's detention using this resource unavailable to many Puerto Ricans after the hurricane speaks directly to the ongoing colonial and extractivist project to which Puerto Rico is being subjected, not least as the star itself comprises the tears atave shed during the colonization of Borinquen, which combine the power of the archipelago's spirits, natural elements, and ancestors. Further referencing the contemporary political climate the comic has been written in, the role of the ceiba tree outlined above stands in stark contrast to the crypto entrepreneur Brock Pierce's actions while, quote, scouting locations for crypto land in Puerto Rico, during which he reportedly crawled into the bosom of a ceiba tree, end quote, an act that resonates deeply with the settler colonialist project of appropriating the land to be refashioned and monetized as the colonizer sees fit. Issue 3 opens with La Borinqueña inside the star, when she encounters Opiel Guaviran, quote, the Taíno semi that guides the souls of lost lives to Coibé, the realm of the spirits, end quote. Also represented in the form of a dog, which is a comparison found in Spanish missionary Ramon Panay's writing, Opiel Guaviran accompanies the spirits of La Borinqueña's Taíno and African-descended ancestors from Coibe to what the reader now learns is Coeia, the timeless dimension inside La Estrella del Camino, which takes its own name from the Taíno word for star. La Borinqueña seeks her escape, and Cacique Mabodacama guides her through a series of ancestral encounters to develop the conocimiento she needs. Such knowledge is gained through both spiritual connection and ritual practice, one step of which is La Borinqueña dancing the spiritually significant bomba, accompanied by the cimarrones, who we saw earlier with the saber tree. After encountering the vejigante figure of Puerto Rican folklore, followed by notable individuals from 19th century resistance movements, La Borinqueña glimpses in the star's crystal facets the events and experimentation befalling her friends and fellow activists in the physical plane. She sheds a tear, the salt water once again connecting her with Atave and Yamaya, and the conocimiento she has developed in Coeia enables her to return to Borinquen. Over several sequences of panels that narrate Puerto Rico's history of resistance, we can locate this oceanic archive of knowledge in an ancestral dimension that connects the physical and metaphorical waters of indigenous and Afrodiasporic spiritualities and folklore. Miranda-Rodriguez seeks the power of myth, historiography, and spirituality as a means to deconstruct decolonial narratives that combat the effects of colonial environmental destruction in Puerto Rico. He writes trauma, resistance, memory, and possibility into a multivalent sea space, both celestial and oceanic, that interweaves mythologies and recognizes the necessity of reciprocal and therefore sustainable relationships with the environment if Puerto Rico and the wider region are to mitigate the current crises. Notably, the superpowered individuals introduced in this third issue of La Borinqueña, derive their powers from the flow of light connecting them to La Borinqueña and La Estrella del Camino. The issue's newly created human bat antagonist, La Gárgola, forces readers to consider the consequences of increased urbanization and hurricanes on Puerto Rico's bat population, as he seeks revenge for his treatment alongside a colony of hybridized megabats. The other four characters we meet, and we can see on the right, team up with La Borinqueña to form the Nitainos. Iguacas and Oro's superpowers reflect characteristics of the Puerto Rican Amazon and the coqui tree frogs, both of which have suffered population decline due to anthropogenic factors. As the short vignette introductions in the next issue show, Iguaca's enhanced connection to the Puerto Rican Amazons around her continues La Borinqueña's reciprocal relationship with the environment. For Oro, his superpowers as a coqui connect him to this endangered species, while his knowledge of the Afro-Puerto Rican combat art of Coco Ballet, which he fights using the detachable horns of his vejigante mask, see him continue the traditional arts of resistance practiced by his Afro-Boricua ancestors and also danced by La Borinqueña. And both of these forms of resistance are forms of physical and spiritual protection at the same time. The vejigante is also the spiritual connection embodied by Brismad, who has developed a deep understanding of technology and a suggested symbiotic relationship with the huge AI machine she has built, which is called Vejigante. For her part, Luz manifests the energy of the Rios de la Luz that connect her to Marisol and to indigenous and Afro-Puerto Rican spirituality. These latter two superheroes gesture towards more sustainable and equitable relationships with technology and power generation in Puerto Rico, in contrast to that La Borinqueña has already fought against. In this multifaceted framework that Miranda-Rodriguez delineates, perhaps these rivers of light could be framed in terms of Ashe, which is the spiritual energy in Santeria and other Afrodiasporic religions present in all living and natural things. This Ashe of the is associated with the rivers and seas, once again returns the reader to the waters of the crossing, its restorative energy, and the many histories in its wakes. Stacy Alaimo observes that, quote, the ocean has been portrayed as the Earth's last frontier of wilderness, in which, in terms of American mythology, positions it as the place for narratives of domination, end quote. Marassa and Borinqueña contest the very premise of this statement, refuting colonialist conceptions of the sea as wilderness and aqua nullius, to read in its many wakes and recognize the ocean as a diverse site of connaissance and conocimiento. These ritual, ancestral, and historical knowledges and practices constitute sea ontologies replete with both memorialization and future potential, exemplifying the reciprocal and sustainable relationships with the environment. The decolonial narrative of reciprocity and sustainability found in the spiritual and mythological crosscurrents of these comics seeks to reject further colonial and neo-colonial actions, presenting worldviews that have long contested the premise of the extractivist hydrocolonial relationship with the environment. They do not present solutions to be mined for their efficacy on a broader scale, but rather they descend en bas de l'eau, beyond space-time, beyond self, to weave transoceanic tapestries of African, Afrodiasporic, and indigenous spiritualities, and write existing and new histories, stories, mythologies, and epistemologies into the third space of resolution, the myth-historical archive of the waters. In so doing, they reorient readers towards mutually sustainable and reciprocal relationships between the human and the more than human, which here are rooted in the multiple and intersecting sea ontologies of the Caribbean. And I'll stop there. Thank you for paying attention. Happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you very much, Paul. That was really, really interesting, and certainly very relevant and pertinent to our project on comics and race in Latin America. I'll start with a couple of questions, if I might. I was interested that these comics are written in English. I mean, they've obviously got, some use of Spanish and French and Creole and so on as well, but they're mainly in English. And that raised for me the question of the audiences. Who are these writers, artists directing who is their audience? Who do they think is their audience? Is it Puerto Ricans, Latinos in the States? I mean, they're presumably published in the United States, these comics. I'm not sure. I'm guessing that's the case. So I just wondered if you could say something a little bit about the choice of language and the choice of what that says about who the audiences are for these comics. And then the other question was a question about the sea and the kind of the potency of the use of the ocean and the sea as a kind of a place, a space, a metaphor, etc. I mean, one could, you can imagine that the sea is a vast thing. It could be the Pacific Ocean, it could be the North Sea, etc. Is there something specific about the Caribbean as an aqueous space that lends itself particularly to this kind of treatment, in the sense of the Caribbean as a geographical space and as a historical space in which the sea has been a very active agent in kind of creating connections between different languages, different peoples, different islands, etc. There's nowhere like the Caribbean. Well, there probably are other areas of the world, but the Caribbean is a particularly kind of potent space, I think, for thinking about those traversing binaries and traversing boundaries and blurring differences and so on. So I just wondered also if you could say something about that.
Sure. So starting with the first question about language, you're right. Both of these comics are written majoritarily in English, with in Marassa that incorporates French, Spanish, and Haitian Creole as kind of words here and there as names of things, as characters' names quite a lot. And the audience from Marassa is definitely the Caribbean diaspora, the Black diaspora in North America. Greg Anderson-Elysée has talked about trying to create to bring the mythologies from of West Africa and the Caribbean to an audience that might be somewhat unaware of it. And so that is one of the things that he's trying to do, but he's doing it not in a didactic way of kind of explaining everything, but rather hoping his reader would be able to read the narratives around Vodou and Santeria and connections into his comic without him telling them about it. So he incorporates those languages in, but the cultural and the religious context is one that he hopes his reader is bringing with them. Rather than telling them how it is, he expects them to go and do their homework, and that's something he's kind of described. La Borinqueña, also mostly in English, but as the issues go on, there is more Spanish included. And so Marisol often speaks in Spanglish, goes between English and Spanish, depending on who she's speaking with. Often speaks more Spanish when she's in Puerto Rico versus when she's in New York. And the question of language there is also interesting because Miranda-Rodriguez is recreating this experience of Latinx folks in North America, and particularly in the US, of speaking in Spanglish, using that as a form of communication, and one that has been particularly marginalized in kind of conversations around linguistic purity and what is correct to be used, right? Also, each time when La Borinqueña interacts with the Taíno in this comic, what Miranda-Rodriguez has done is he's made sure that the reader is aware that this is being automatically translated from Taíno into English. And he does it through the color of the word balloons. And so he's putting the word balloons in purple to denote that this is a translation into English. And then interestingly, when the Spanish colonialists are there and the conquistadores are there and fighting against the Taíno, he puts those word balloons in orange, kind of denoting that as the other, the outside narrative, the outside language, in contrast to the purple of the Taíno and the normative white word balloons that are either in English or in a mix of English and Spanish when Marisol is speaking. So he also thinks of his comics as for a North American audience, but also a Puerto Rican audience. There's a very close connection between Miranda-Rodriguez and Puerto Rico through the foundation that he created related to the comics, which I can talk about separately because it's not an answer to this question. And these comics have been launched at Puerto Rican Comic-Con, and you know, so there's a direct tie to the archipelago there, and trying to bring these stories to a broad audience, right? The sea is a big question. The sea is definitely a place of power and potency. And if we think about the histories that these comics are engaging with, histories of enslavement, of the denigration of Afrodiasporic spirituality, the sea becomes this place, as I mentioned, like it's a traumatic space, but a place of home, is a space of like division but connection, and so it's very complicated. And that's one of the things that Christina Sharp speaks to in her book in the Wake, asking us to think about the many meanings of the sea, particularly the Atlantic is what she's focusing on there. And I think for these comics that kind of situate their narratives both in the Atlantic and in the Caribbean Sea, is drawing on that very long legacy of trauma and resistance, and drawing these connections between the Caribbean, but also recognizing the differences. One of the important elements of kind of thinking about an oceanic archive and sea ontologies is not that the sea means that everything becomes a monolithic whole, that it just becomes this kind of multivalent space where you can't distinguish between differences. It is a space of connection, but importantly, this space of recognizing these differences. And it's been theorized, I don't know if you're going to like theory of the Caribbean, you know, from Benitez Rojo and folks all, and you know, Kamal Brathwaite and tide dialectics. So, you know, I'm kind of drawing on all of those kind of notions and themes to think about what the sea can mean in these comics, especially in comics that happen for part of it, not in a watery space, but in a kind of a celestial sea space.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, anyone else want to ask a question? I should remind you that we are recording. If you don't want to be recorded, then let me know. I'll turn it off. James.
Hi. Thanks, Paul. Thanks so much. Good to see you. Thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I was just wondering how you felt these artists used the form to speak to some of these themes, and maybe sort of specifically 3 things in particular, or the things that I kind of thought about or was thinking about in terms of the relationship between how they used the page or how they use the kind of comics form to talk about archive or archives. And the second one was, and I guess these two are slightly connected, right? But one is the sea and the sense of sort of fluidity, because quite often it seems that comics is, I don't know, I always think about that kind of how do you draw water in comics when you're constantly putting things in a very kind of rigid structure, and where they play, you know, I noticed in the second one, for example, you got panels that kind of cut in this kind of curve across the page, which didn't seem very evident in the first one. And then the other thing was about the sort of relationship between division and connection, and how that might play out in terms of the comics form as well.
Yeah. So thinking about the sea as an archive, one of the things that I've been like reflecting on, and I haven't kind of gone into super deep depth on this, but it's a conversation I've been having when I teach one of my classes about kind of imagining queer Caribbean futures in comics and speculative fiction, and thinking about the importance for Afrodiasporic religions, the importance of oral history and the telling of histories over and over again. Oral history requires like a co-creation, right? Like there's a person that's narrating the history, the person that's listening to the history, and will, like, with many different forms of that history being told to them, then relay it to others, right? It's not just there's one fixed form of history and it gets passed on in a preset way. And I've been thinking that about in terms of comics. What do these particular comics do that allow for the reader to participate in that gaining knowledge, receiving that knowledge, co-creating it in a way? You know, we can think about how reading comics is co-creation. I don't need to explain that to you, James. So it is representing these Afrodiasporic religions in comics a process of moving from oral history being solely oral to kind of replicating it on a page in a way where the reader is also kind of involved in the creation of that history. And I think the wordless panels from Marassa is one of the examples there where we're receiving knowledge, we're seeing someone else gain knowledge, and we're having to narrate it. Right, and so we're in a co-creative space there. So that was one of the things I was thinking about, is if oral history is the archive of Afrodiasporic religions, then are these being recreated on the page through comics?
And there's an interesting play there between an oral history and a wordlessness, right?
Yeah, so oral history is one of the ways that this knowledge is transmitted and passed on, but also it's an embodied knowledge. It's it's the different rituals and rites that you partake in that also tell these histories. It's interesting if you go to La Borinqueña, that both La Borinqueña, so La Borinqueña is dancing bomba, which is a dance in Puerto Rico heavily kind of steeped in a history of resistance of Afro-Puerto Rican people against colonialism, and continually against colonialism, and is practiced in across the island, but in particular Afro-Puerto Rican communities. So she is embodying that that transition of knowledge that she learns from the cimarrones, who are the spirits that she meets in the Ceiba, and then Oro, who's fighting Coco Ballet, another form of it's a martial art, but it's closely related to Bomba and the telling of histories of resistance and continuing that resistance as Afro-Puerto Ricans. So both of those kind of examples also have this archive continue, right, through their embodied practices. And I think the link to the sea is you know, obviously I think it's super important, but in La Borinqueña, it's important that she finds these tiers, which are salt water, in the fresh water of the caves, and she has this very close relationship with the water. She can manipulate water, she can manipulate the wind, and she can manipulate land. And so that close connection is drawing on those spiritual archives. You did give it the answer that was the first answer I thought of about with how does the comic page show fluidity, with the example of where the panel comes across the page. And that happens quite a lot in La Borinqueña, where the panels invite the reader to experience a little bit of what is being represented. There's another example where La Borinqueña's best friend, Lala, she hits her head while surfing, and she descends to the bottom of the ocean, and then La Borinqueña goes in, and in the panel is 3 vertical panels where you're required to go up with Lala and La Borinqueña to then come down in her being saved, and then so your experience when you're reading is one that is being replicated or the experience of the characters is replicated for the reader there. In Marassa, I think like the representation of the sea there, and he focuses, there's that series of panels where you go into the sea, and you know there's still kind of regularly drawn panels, you know, they have 4 sides, some are overlaid on top of the other ones, but elsewhere in the comic, when he's thinking about the celestial, what I call the celestial waters, so he's in kind of the space, there's more of a free form to the panels. They might be full page panels. I don't think they go as far as La Borinqueña in kind of inviting us to have that that experience, but yeah, I think in some elements the artwork is asking us to have that experience at the same time. And the division and the connection, I do think with kind of the overlaying of panels in some of the examples I gave in Marassa, kind of invites us to come into that, or experience that connection between the two. And the series of 3 panels, 3 pages that I showed, has that kind of, you're experiencing in a kind of a linear way the experience of Shelley, but each time you go further down, you come out of a framed panel into an unframed panel. So it's like an extra kind of step down, and the same happens when you go into the threshold of the waters. And then the 3rd level, which is Guinéen, the space of the dead, is another kind of step backwards, and so you're falling from these framed panels into these unframed panels. Maybe that answers your question with just some examples. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for the. I'm sorry, I lost my voice a few days ago and still is in the process of returning. Thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I want to ask you how, in the case of La Borinqueña, how the comic, the graphic novel, or the character imagines Latin America as a space, because from what I understood is this kind of typical narrative in which a character sort of goes into re-encountering her identity, etc. But in a Puerto Rico confined in a sort of isolated way, or mostly thought in terms of its relationship with the metropolis, with the United States. So it's sort of this kind of two-dimensional relationship between Puerto Rico and the US, and I guess it's sort of a general Latino identity that is again comprised to the US. So is the comic making any references to other Caribbean countries or Spanish-speaking Caribbean or other parts of Latin America? How is this portrayed? Or maybe I'm getting it wrong, but that's the impression I got.
Yeah, so the comic focuses not exclusively, but very strongly on Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican diaspora in New York City. But there are other references that it has outside of Puerto Rico, mostly through La Borinqueña, or Marisol's best friend, Lala, her name is Lauren Lala Lu. She is of Chinese Dominican descent. And she grows up in New York City alongside Marisol, and so they're kind of best buddies, inseparable in many ways, and we see that go throughout all of the issues of the comic. And she then becomes loose in the Taíno's kind of squad team that they create at the end of issue 3. So there's that reference to other places in Latin America, but it focuses very much on La Borinqueña as someone who is Nuyorican, and unashamedly Nuyorican, and then moving back to Puerto Rico and having that experience of being neither New Yorker in her Nuyorican identity and neither Puerto Rican in a Puerto Rican identity, and so experiencing that on both sides. I don't see a ton of references outside from Puerto Rico, apart from that one with Lala. And I think Edgardo Miranda-Rodriguez is trying to tell this story of resistance and rejection of colonialism, and the ongoing colonial status of Puerto Rico, right?
Sorry, if I cannot, because I know very little about Puerto Rican literature or Nuyorican literature, but my main reference is Ana Lidia Vega, and she's always arguing that the way around Puerto Rican nationalism only can be conceived, according to her, as part of sort of a pan-Caribbean project of wider emancipation. I mean, the Puerto Rico has special status, but generally speaking, the entire Spanish-speaking Caribbean is still subject to the interventionism of the US. So I was trying to think if there is sort of this attempt to create sort of a Pan-American identity beyond the specific experiences of a Nuyorican person who is returning to Puerto Rico or going to Puerto Rico and encountering her culture in quotation marks.
And I would say to respond to that would be the connection that is being drawn across the Caribbean is the connection to Taíno identity. And so the making Taíno history present in this kind of in this comic universe that Edgardo has created, making it present and central to the narrative is something that then allows for this experience of colonialism to be read elsewhere, right? And this experience of resistance to colonialism to be read in other places. Other scholars who've written about La Borinqueña have talked about whether the use of Taíno identity is somewhat stereotypical or something that's kind of imagining a past. And I would say that if these comics, as I argue, offer a decolonial future, when we read them together, then it's necessary to engage with other ways of knowing and being in the world, especially in Puerto Rico, which continues to be in this colony of the US. So with that in mind, turning to the Taíno experience and then the larger ramifications of that across the Caribbean could be one way of reading this as looking outside of Puerto Rico. So yeah, that's what I would say. That's one way to read it, but I would say he focuses majoritarily on Puerto Rico and that the relationship between the diaspora and the island.
Okay, any other questions or comments? I was going to ask Paul, whether you think there's a kind of link between the blurrings of boundaries that take place in terms of spaces and species, how those link to blurrings of sex gender binaries, whether those elements, because I mean these kinds of religions, especially, well, I'm not so sure about Santeria and Vodou, but certainly in Candomblé there's a whole kind of literature about how it's a particular space for LGBTQ people and communities and so forth, you know, not just now, but going back to Africa, in fact. So I just wondered what kind of connections you saw between these two processes, especially in relation to decolonial environmentalism.
Yeah, with Marassa, when both of these comics, there are gestures towards representing folks that are LGBTQ identified. You know, there's queer relationships shown in both of the comics. But beyond just the representation of queer relationships, there's one kind of thing I've been thinking about is the idea of transpossession in Santeria and in Vodou, and how that idea of transcorporeality can be related to narratives that also go beyond binaries.
Right.
And when I talk about transpossession, I'm thinking of, you know, of when Orishas or Luan, you know, perform themselves through the bodies of practitioners. Yeah. And Roberto Strongman has written about this idea or this topic in Candomblé, Santeria, and Vodou, using this term transcorporeality, which interestingly is a term that Stacey Alaimo uses to think about the sea. And so Stacey Alaimo, in using the term kind of beforehand, she is talking about the interconnected nature between all entities that engage with the sea, right? And so thinking of that as transcorporeal. So it's not something I've developed further, but it's on my mind as something that I've come to recently as like, oh, so there's folks talking about transcorporeality to do with the sea, there's folks talking about it to do with possession performance, and is there a way that these comics bring these two together in a kind of a theoretical sense?
Interesting.
That's as far as that thought process has gotten.
Okay, no, interesting. That's very interesting. Okay, any final questions or comments? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was really interesting and good discussion. So yeah, and thank you everyone for attending who's still in the room.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for kind of listening to these kind of papers. And also kind of engaging in the conversation. If people do want slides, I do have a PDF of the slides, so I can share that with you if you would like them.
Okay.
So.
All right, great. Thanks, Paul. Okay, well, have a good rest of your day, and everyone else have a good evening.
Thanks, bye.
Okay, bye-bye, bye.